Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicholas DeMoncho, Head of Architecture here at MIT. I extend my thanks and welcome to all of you for joining us here tonight for a very special event with Mariam Kamara as part of our department's Spring 2021 online public programming. Given that MIT still exists in the world in a physical place, which we are returning to carefully, I want to begin, as is now our practice, by saying that MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which MIT sits is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. The risk of such words, of course, is that they remain words. The best possibility, however, is that they narrate the world yet to come. Tonight, we welcome Mariam Kamara for a presentation. How we narrate our yesterday determines how we imagine the future of architecture, followed by a conversation with myself and a group of students all working in their own way to narrate a powerful future for our discipline and the world it serves. About a year ago, I was in a conversation about the future of architecture with a good friend and MIT graduate, Omar Rabi, an Egyptian architect based in Oroville in India. He was explaining to me an exciting project that he had even during lockdown in Niger. And he described the objective of himself and his studio of producing a project that they simply would not be embarrassed to show to Mariam Kamara. This is but one small but essential indication of the esteem with which Mariam is rightfully held and in which the regard with which her buildings are considered. She's an architect from Niger who studied at the University of Washington and in 2013 became a founding member of the architectural collective United for Design. They collaborated on Niamey 2000, a housing development which was awarded Architects Magazine's 2017 R+D Award for Innovation. In 2014, Kamara founded Atelier masōmī, an architecture and research practice that tackles public, cultural, residential, commercial, and urban design projects globally. They are the authors of many award-winning projects, from the Hikma Religious and Secular Complex, recipient of several LafargeHolcim Awards, to the Dandaji Regional Market, which was shortlisted for the Dezeen Awards in 2019, and the creator of upcoming projects, including the Niamey Cultural Centre, which Kamara collaborated with under the mentorship of Sir David Adjaye as part of the Rolex Mentor and Protégé program. In 2019, she was named as a laureate of the Prince Claus Award and a finalist for the Royal Academy of Arts Dorfman Award. And last year, the New York Times named her as one of 15 creative women of our time, and Atelier masōmī made its debut on the 2021 80-100 list. After her presentation, as I said, we will be joined in a much larger conversation by several of members of our community working on projects and agendas related to Mariam's, and I'm really looking forward in particular to that part of the conversation. Mohammed Ismail is a PhD candidate in building technology here in the department. He's trained as both a civil engineer and an architect, and he studies the potential for structural and material optimization in the alleviation of housing insecurity in the global south. Nada Al-Mullah is a Master of Architect candidate at MIT. She received her undergraduate degree in architecture from the American University of Sharjah, and her work investigates the role culture and technology plays in informing architectural concepts and processes. Kelly Fleikert is an architect pursuing her SMARCS degree in building technology here, where she joins the Digital Structures Research Group led by Kate Mueller. Her work aims to reduce embodied carbon in buildings through the critical evaluation of construction materials and methods. So that's a small picture of our community, and we look forward to sharing a conversation of community with all of you after we hear a presentation from Mariam. So with that, I'll ask Mariam to queue up her own presentation and join us virtually here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, Mariam.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. It is such a pleasure and such an honor to be here tonight. I've been looking forward to this for months since we last spoke and decided to do this lecture. And I'm definitely specifically looking forward to the discussion afterwards. I'm going to try to run through my presentation as quickly as possible because honestly, the discussion is the highlight for me as well. So if you just bear with me for a little bit, I'm going to queue up a presentation. Hopefully I don't blunder it. As Nicholas said, I'm from Niger in West Africa, where I've started my practice. And I really enjoy showing this map often when I start a talk to show not only where Niger is, but to show also what kind of conditions it's in geographically and climatically speaking. It is a country where the majority of it is empty and is occupied by the Sahara Desert. And this is really relevant because it's basically the most removed I can imagine being in terms of context and challenges compared to where I got my education from here in the US. I spent a big part of my childhood in the Sahara Desert, actually. An hour from the mining town I lived in was the 15th century city of Agadez, which you can see one of the buildings and the most famous building of the city, the Friday Mosque in this picture. And with its traditional architecture that is still inhabited by families that have been there for generations. And one of the most enduring memories of that time is this sense of harmony with the land in the small lanes of the city and, you know, the intricate interiors and courtyards as you enter these homes, and this really sense of just kind of comfort and thermal delights, really. You know, the architecture was made of adobe that was painstakingly maintained over generations, and which was responsible for the comfort of the interior temperatures, despite the fact that the temperature often reached 110 degrees, 115, 20 degrees outside. But the amazing thing about living there is that what I was learning in school, you know, about Egypt and archaeology in 5th grade, there were actually archaeological sites right outside my town where evidence of what is known now as the Green Sahara period was everywhere. This is a period of time where the Sahara was actually teeming with people, a civilization, you know, kind of a Stone Age civilization with, you know, tools, with a little bit of farming, with flora and fauna that was just really generous, which is very difficult to imagine now, especially for me as I was growing up there. But we essentially lived above history, which was over 10,000 years old. And we could easily just go out to the mountains, you know, with my family and see caves with Neolithic carvings on their surfaces and pieces of pottery from that time, or polished stone tools just on the ground everywhere. It was quite incredible. And actually in 2019, I went back and it was unfortunately, heartbreakingly, completely empty, aside from the carvings that you could still see. All the artifacts and objects that I used to see just strewn on the ground have all vanished. They've been emptied out. As tourists have come through, you know, collectors and archaeologists who I guess apparently can just pick up and go with whatever they find. And these artifacts are now all in Western museums and part of, you know, people's personal collections far away from Niger. But living in such an environment, its architecture, its climate, its history, really gave me this unshakable influence on what ended up becoming my ideas of beauty and sustainability, you know, when it came to architecture. Because what I lived in that region, my formal elementary school taught me about, you know, the great empires and vast wealth and, you know, first universities and grand architecture and great culture that populated the area, you know, through different kingdoms and empires, you know, that were actually all around. Keeping in mind that for pretty much all African countries, our borders are artificial. Because they were just kind of superimposed after colonization, either by the British or by the French. But there used to be empires and kingdoms there that overlap now multiple countries. You know, whether it's the Kanem Empire. I'm just kind of going through some of the cultures and people that affected what ended up making Niger today. Some of the first Hausa states in that straddle Niger and Nigeria, or the Mali Empire, which I guess while some of you might have been learning about Alexander the Great, I was learning about Sundiata Keita, who was the founder of the Mali Empire in the 11th century, or the Songhai Empire in the 13th century, the Sokoto Caliphate later on, and then ending up with French colonization in the late 18th and early 20th century. And I made these maps when I was working on my architecture thesis. And when I put them all together, I really took the full measure of what a blip really European colonization was in our history. And in contrast to how much it has honestly, quite frankly, stifled and almost successfully erased us, culturally speaking, architecturally speaking. It was very unsettling for me to see, but also it gave me paradoxically, a sense of greater confidence in knowing that, there was just kind of, amazing wealth of history, of culture, and references to draw from that span such a large time, I guess, chronology in our history. And it made also evident how subjective historical chronologies are, really. If you look at how history might be laid out in the Islamic world, for example, which is also relevant to my world, considering that Niger is 95% Muslim, these would be the main areas or turning points that would be singled out as the markers of Islamic history, from ancient time to the birth of Islam, to the first caliphate, to the fragmentation, that happened later on, to the confrontation with the Crusaders and a rebirth area, et cetera, all the way to current day Islamist reaction. But on the other side, there's very little intersection between that historical timeline and something that would be more of a Eurocentric perspective of history. So, when you're looking at it from a Eurocentric point of view, history reads more as in, first there was the birth of civilization, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, the classical age with Greece, and Rome, the rebirth during the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, revolutions, all the different world wars, which incidentally, I always thought bizarre when I was in school that they were called world wars because they really only had to do with Europe, but anyway, and I guess later on World War II with America, the Cold War, and then the triumph of democratic capitalism. So then the fact that this chronology effectively rules our educational system and understanding of how the world works, for me, quickly became problematic and really kind of set the way for how I experienced my architecture education when I came to the US. Because fundamentally it impacts what we view as the key references that we look at, in architecture. If we consider that the recent timelines between, for example, the Renaissance and 20th century in Europe, during that same time in India, Mughal architecture was at its peak, yet we don't know anything about it aside from an image or two of the Taj Mahal. And earlier, even during the European Middle Ages, Sahelian empires that I showed earlier were at their peak economically, culturally, and architecturally. But the point is that, our current narrower view of what constitutes the important achievements and really the milestone of mankind really misses an enormous amount of wealth and knowledge for us to draw from as architecture students. And when I started studying architecture, I discovered, quite unfortunately, just how little space was devoted to the rest of the world compared to what was given to Eurocentric architecture. When you think back of the Eurocentric chronology that I was showing earlier, it makes sense. And this bias, in a way, would be fine if it was made clear that this was only one point of view. But the problem is that it is represented as the only point of view, a truth about the entire planet. And it kind of presented a vision of the place and importance of Eurocentric architecture in history, and its contribution to history is understood to be universal and kind of undeniable. And I think that was probably the most difficult thing for me to come to terms with. Actually, I still haven't come to terms with it. That was the absolute most shocking thing. Coming from where I came from, having had I guess an education that was completely non-Eurocentric, it jumped out at me immediately. And so studying in the US really felt like I was constantly being asked to unlearn what I knew to be true. And I was always questioned really for seeking inspirations and areas of study elsewhere. There was always kind of this almost suspicion about, well, why why are you referencing such and such building, rather than, I don't know, whatever else we're asking you to study. Because at the end of the day, I knew that amazing things also happened elsewhere. It wasn't just all, modernism. It wasn't all, I don't know, the Renaissance. And I realized over time that the lopsided nature of how architecture history is studied, in a way, allow us to simply, and this is the best case scenario, dismiss the rest of the world as sometimes, as kind of these faraway places that have sometimes provided us with beautiful but really primitive buildings and architecture, and it made Western buildings the only ones really worthy of true regard and of reference. It also indicated, the education also indicates which materials we should use. So not because of not because those are the materials that the context demands, but because that is what the canon really of architecture demands of us, So all of a sudden, we cannot imagine designing without either concrete or wood or glass or steel, which is far from being, these are far from being universal materials all over the world. And another thing that I really had a hard time with, I think when I was studying, was the notion of, so this universality, obviously, of Western theories and styles, but I was fighting things like, the idea of, as simple as the idea of what constitutes a good and desirable public space, for example, like what is shown in this image, which frankly looks quite pleasant. But I couldn't help, whenever I was confronted with an image like this, to imagine and to cringe at the thought of the same space in a country like Niger on a scorching 115 day, 115 degree day, and how it would be literally the most horrible place imaginable under those conditions, right? So obviously what we were being taught, just couldn't be a universal answer. And really, as placemakers and monument makers and culture makers, which is what we are, as architects, it really does us a disservice. We end up with much less tools in our arsenal of designers with which to really tackle challenges that are thrown our way. I remember taking a studio course where I had to design a proposal for a girls' school in Afghanistan that an American NGO meant to build there. And we were asked to work in pairs, and my partner was Yasamin Esmaili, and with whom I collaborated actually on a couple other projects, including Niamey 2000 and the Hikma complex, which I'll touch on later on. And she was from Iran. We were the only two Muslim women in the class, and that changed everything for how we ended up developing the project, obviously, for another Muslim country and for other Muslim women. One of the things that really caught our attention and made us realize just the gap that exists, between our education and kind of just the lack of knowledge that there is about the rest of the world and other experiences, was that the NGO presented the project to the class. And one of the challenges that they mentioned was the fact that they had many mishaps in other schools they built, that they built in the country, in Afghanistan, particularly with the toilets. And the problem was that, to their dismay, the students often filled them with stones, and they didn't know how to teach them, quote unquote, how to properly use these wonderful flush toilets that they installed for them. But Yasaman and I immediately understood, what was going on. Obviously, in Islam, when you use the restroom, it is imperative that you clean yourself with water. Number one, toilet paper does not cut it. And in the absence of water, one of the prescriptions, for example, if you're traveling, or something like that, you don't have easy access to water, is that you can use a stone as a purifying agent, so to speak, after you do your business. So that was the reason, right? Rather than kind of some kind of supposed either backwardness or inability to understand, what was being given to you or handed down to you. But it was really the first time that I took the full measure of how self-centered, our education and our approach to space making was. And it was so self-centered that, I started realizing that we, through the way things are set up, we become actually incapable of reading architecture without frantically searching in our brains, for the Western precedents that we can attach it to. There's an implied understanding that no matter what you design anywhere in the world, its source somehow is assumed to automatically be some European or American precedent. The first time I realized this was when we designed this project Niamey 2000, which is a housing project, and that was kind of served back to me in terms of, as an analysis, as being a Bauhaus-inspired building, which completely shocked and confused me because that was I didn't even look at that. But I guess when you look at some of the Bauhaus-inspired, buildings, it just kind of becomes evident why. And because we have been trained to not only analyze things through a small set of references, we're never really exposed to anything else. So of course, that's the first thing your mind will go to. But the true inspiration for that building was Hausa architecture, which was one of the pre-colonial kingdoms that I showed, which constitutes parts of Niger, and the other half of it is in northern Nigeria currently. And we inspired ourselves really from cities like Zender in Niger or Kano in Nigeria, or also, as shown in this image, Djenné in Mali, both in terms of form, but also in terms of climatic response. And so the project looked at the home as it is culturally used in Niger, with its public space, semi-public zones, private family zones, and formed buildings to accommodate that, as opposed to, the way we're used to designing homes, either an open plan approach or, these homes with, like an entrance, a foyer, a living room, dining room, kitchen, and all of that. We don't use homes like that at all. So the challenge for this project was really to recapture this cultural way of inhabiting the home, with interiors that boast contemporary courtyards that serve the same functions they have done for hundreds of years, which is to help cool temperatures, provide light, provide privacy from the street, but also provide social space for its inhabitants, which is incredibly important culturally speaking. And also, this is a project where we relied heavily on local materials, and natural ventilation mechanism to help decrease energy consumption and make the homes more affordable in the long term. And considering the economic challenge that Niger presents in terms of home ownership, this was incredibly important for this project to achieve. And similarly, when we had the opportunity to develop a design for a mosque and a library in Niger. This was in a rural area. We really we were really trying to not just go and copy what a mosque would look like in the Middle East, for example, which is very much what is done now. In the same way that if someone has to do an office building, they would just go copy some glass and steel, a building and just plop it down. Similarly, in most Muslim countries, we just copy nowadays, we just copy what we see happening in the UAE, or something like that in terms of a mosque. But what was really interesting for us was to question even that typology, because unlike Christianity, Islam doesn't really have a set prescribed function and general typology for its places of worship. You can find places actually in the street where literally just a square made of, just like 30 centimeter of brick, just outlining a square, it constitutes a mosque. There's absolutely no prescription. And so for us, then it was this great opportunity to look at the fact that, or to honor the fact that different regions of the world have done it in different ways. And so we went back and looked to references from early Hausa architecture again, of Hausa mosque architecture and mosque typologies, in order to design more of a 21st century, I guess, version of it, where it wasn't, what you would typically see in the Middle Eastern, in the Middle Eastern mosque, but it would be more what you would encounter in terms of introducing rooms like these at the beginning, where you don't really have a door, you have these gate rooms that are used for your ablutions before you go inside of the mosque proper. And these kinds of spaces have all been vanished from the architecture of mosques in Niger. However, this is an incredibly functional and important space, and there's absolutely no reason to get rid of it. We collaborated with local masons and contemporary engineers to produce what we really wanted to be new interpretations of, traditional dome architecture of the region, for example, rather than, just go in some other, in my view, arbitrary proposition for structural support. It allowed us to further anchor the building really as part of a cultural and stylistic evolution of the region, rather than importing, structural solutions, like I said, that, would be relatively arbitrary, either because we like how they look, or, or maybe we want to make a lighter structure, or something like that. I mean, there can be reasons you can justify all day long, why you make the choices that you make. But at the end of the day, we found it much more useful, both for the project, but also for local collaboration and the furthering of local technology, to really delve into traditional forms and see how we can move those along. And, ultimately for this project, the awareness of the history of the mosque, program type in other parts of the world, rather than, in this narrow focus, allow us to draw from 9th century knowledge centers in places like Baghdad, for example, where mosques often went hand in hand with libraries, with schools and research centers, which were teeming with scholars. So we were able to bring back, not only this traditional architecture of the mosque of the region, but then a typology when it came to the complex itself that was really speaking to the root, the cultural root of a religion, of a place. And this was directly relevant and important to us to do, because we were working in a context, of growing tension between secular knowledge and religious practice. In case, if you don't know, Niger is actually surrounded literally on every side by countries where there's a lot of extremist activity. There are a lot of kind of terrorism worries, and a lot of that fight, is about the purity, of the religion, or at least the proposition of the purity of the religion. And put in that, put it against that, secular knowledge. But this project allowed us to actually have a more truthful discussion about what the religion actually is, about the fact that Islam is actually a religion that within which you are actually demanded as a Muslim. It's demanded of you that you go and seek out knowledge as far away as Asia if you must. And it was really that knowledge that allowed us to make this project also accepted locally, as opposed to creating a reaction of people feeling that what we were doing was essentially blasphemy, by teaming up this religious aspect and the secular aspect. And in the end, the objective was really to bring about a richer solution that will use a wider toolbox of knowledge to produce something that is still very much rooted in the local context, but that, but which we just grabbed from everywhere, any aspects that would be useful to the project was really kind of tapped into. And the research and extensive dialogue, with the local community we were able to do allowed us to address even more contemporary concern around the building, around the building technology, as I explained, on one hand, but also around social challenges like the inclusion of the youth and women, in the spaces that were traditionally male-dominated, ultimately making the project something that decidedly belongs to the 21st century. And but as I, to the risk of repeating myself, also represented this natural evolution of both the society, but also of the architectural tradition. And it's not to say that this type of approach has been easy, because often the game, so to speak, feels rigged, working in this context. For instance, in some parts of the world, even what we think as being local architecture or vernacular architecture is actually a fabrication. So in West Africa, specifically in French colonized West Africa, there's this style that is often spoken about called Neo-Sudanese architecture. And Neo-Sudanese architecture is actually a style that was created by the French. It's not indigenous, and it consisted taking buildings like the Djenné Mosque, which is shown here, or the Timbuktu Mosque. And those two mostly were taken as these archetypes of the only thing that West Africa had to offer in terms of, good architecture that the French could use. And they turned that into a style and a basis for all of the administrative and monumental buildings for all of the territories that were under their rule. So from Senegal all the way to Chad, and all the way, I think the ambition was all the way to Djibouti, I guess, on the east side of Africa. And so that's why we ended up having this maternity ward in Senegal that looks almost exactly like the Djenné Mosque, but it's a maternity ward. Or this train station in Bobo Dioulasso in Burkina Faso, or the presidential palace in Niger. All of them, have one thing in common. So they kind of, reminiscent, the last two are more reminiscent of the Timbuktu Mosque, which I don't have a good image of right now. But they all look like mosques, complete with minarets. And the irony of it is that there are currently calls in Niamey, in Niger right now, to preserve this particular building, for example, which is a beautiful building, and to turn it into a museum, but as a stellar example of the epitome of our traditional architecture, which of course it's not. So, the chronological interruption in the architectural evolution of a place like Niger, kind of, left this vacuum, right? Where you have these fabricated styles on one end, and then on the other hand, you have kind of the struggle for modernization, which has come to mean just kind of this aesthetic, this international style aesthetic that apparently the whole world is supposed to use in order to be deemed evolved and to be deemed civilized. And so for us, it has meant that we've had to deal with a dearth of modern precedents that are locally viable, and also in the face of very little scholarship. So we've had to do a lot of research that is focused on more, stories that people would tell, collaborations, discussions, and just find everything that we can find in terms of resources. It's incredibly time and energy consuming. But essentially the challenge has been coming up with new continuities um, to figure out or to help flesh out a way forward as we see it. And one thing that might be surprising is that our references, or the references that we look to, are not just always local, but they're often geographically related or climatically related. In the face of global challenges like climate change, food insecurities, or excessive energy consumptions, um, I spend a lot of time looking at similar conditions. For example, for a project that I'm working on. So if I'm working in Niger, which is an arid country, I will look for precedents in similar geographic, or desert, regions in Asia or South America or anywhere else I can draw parallels, for solutions. So it's one thing we've been looking at a lot, when working in Niger, was the desert regions of India that use step wells, for example, for rainwater harvesting, which is something that is now done in Niger, but used to be done in Mali. But the step wells, or the kind of water reservoirs, have all but vanished, and we can't really, find them or study them as easily. Or we would look at wind catchers, in Iran, to help to help cool building interiors and to lower energy consumption naturally. Or the very first tall structures made out of earth in Yemen, for a look at alternative building technologies, and density mechanisms. And recently, while working on the design for a large cultural center complex in Niamey that is just about to go under construction right now, all of these approaches, and these ways of approaching the practice became crystallized, going kind of from a site, imagining interconnected, public spaces, public zones, within it as a starting point for kind of freer access to the project, looking at natural gathering points that might be possible on the site, but also being conscious, as I pointed out in the beginning of this talk, of the fact that temperatures are really harsh, for open spaces in Niger. So then going on to, create shade through sculptural forms that also serve as landmark and beacons, for the project. And then organizing indoor program around all of that for people to enjoy, effortlessly, creating indoor and outdoor relationships, which is very typical in Nigerian architecture a lot, where we tend to have these really fragmented architecture so that things can breathe a bit more and you don't have to rely so much on mechanical cooling, developing different natural cooling mechanisms, by taking advantage of these sculptural towers that are used for shade, outside, how to harvest rainwater, which is really precious in an area where it only rains 3 months out of the year, for example, and then using it to irrigate, gardens, grow food, shady trees all over the project for people to enjoy. So the result was really a set of buildings that draw from the site, from the narratives of the place, but also anticipates on future challenges by finding low cost and really simple ways to mitigate these challenges. And at the same time, just like we did for the mosque project, the architecture builds on forms and structural solutions and materials that are familiar to traditional builders. And that really helps stretch their skills with more dramatic scales and help the technologies really evolve as we did precedently, but it just kind of turbocharged this time, I guess. So ultimately, I think this is why I believe that what we know of ourselves and who we think we are is really vastly important, particularly in architecture. It often determines how we approach the work, obviously, especially because, again, we've been trained to look at precedent and to look to precedents, for guidance. And when we bring everything back to just one set of people, one history, rather than give proper credit to sources of our inspiration, which there are plenty in Western architecture, but never acknowledged, we really develop a false sense of superiority, which really benefits no one, ultimately. Unfortunately, except for the superficial, odd, cultural appropriation, which is usually simply aesthetic, we never really seek answers elsewhere, and we rely on a reduced set of tools to solve our problems instead. Whether we try to reduce energy consumption by relying on solar panels, systematically, for example, which is really just one more fabricated thing, one more, technological, or one more, and actually, this is just kind of like a parenthesis, about solar panels that we want to rely on so heavily. They're important. They allow us to not pollute by, using electricity made from oil and other polluting agents. But they also create pollution because they have to be fabricated in factories. So again, there are just all kinds of it goes to my point of these reduced sets of solutions that we have at our disposal because we're just so laser focused on just one way of doing things and one evolution of technologies, and that we end up really, being faced with a missed opportunity that our education and our scholarship, and even images we produce in popular culture could really help overturn. And ultimately, I think that by seeking more complete and really more truthful narratives of the world we live in and how it came to be, and alternative ways to look at things, we would probably emerge, on the other end as in a much more exciting and frankly much more interesting world. So I just want to kind of leave it at that, and then hope to have a fantastic discussion after this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariam. That was amazing and incredibly thoughtfully presented. I guess I want to see the conversation with two related questions and then open it up to our group as a whole. As you spoke, I was very much taken by the thought that just like ideas of space can get colonized, so can ideas of time. And I have two different time-related questions that you can answer separately or even connect if you want. One is related to the way in which the media ecology that developed alongside architecture's cultural power in the 20th century tends to focus us completely falsely on buildings as designed for the moment that they're occupied just after they're finished, which is like a microsecond, a blink in the eye of the lifetime, both of a creative project and of a building in the city and ecology. So it'd be wonderful to hear you talk a little bit more about your relationship with builders and fabricators, which I know you've cultivated very deliberately, and then also the life of the buildings and spaces you make after they're built and finished, and how they transform themselves in ways that you imagine and ways that you haven't imagined as well, as is always inevitably the case. And then a kind of related question, especially as and maybe we can take this up also as our students come into the conversation. I'm really interested, given where you began with your own education, at how you would also help us attack the fiction that a designer is fully formed. They don't exist, and then suddenly they also appear in the media as a kind of person. And so that relates to another question, which is about designing the education of designers themselves. And I think you shared a lot of very perceptive criticisms of the limitations of architectural education as we've received it as a cultural artifact, its lack of true global perspective, its complicity in a kind of certain kinds of globalization, well-glazed globalization that doesn't necessarily suit both either the climates or the cultures of the communities we need to serve. So it would be delightful maybe also to thread into your answers both now and over the course of our conversation some ideas about education itself, given that's the context in which we are happy to be meeting with you, and from which a lot of the impact of your lecture will be taken to try and reimagine what we do as well.
Wow. Okay. Let me start with your question in terms of time and the whole building process. I think one of the things that I have found the most exciting about practicing, where I practice and the way that I practice is really this relationship, with builders, with artisans, but also with the future users, very, very, as importantly. And really, I don't really view architecture as just kind of like this finished building that you just, that the end goal is not actually the finished building ever. The whole process for me is incredibly exciting. So for me, the building actually begins when we start talking about it, not even when it's finished, right? Because the kind of imagination around it, the hope around it, the aspirations around it are incredibly important. And then the process of making it by collaborating with, local fabricators, and local builders, also means that for us, we actually have to understand how they work. We have to understand their craft so that we can design with that in mind. So it's not the kind of situation where we just go off, and make a design, and then we find some contractor and we're like, here you go, please build this, and these are all my specifications and everything is perfectly, and these are all my detail sheets, and give me a catalog with like every, so I can pick my materials.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't work that way at all. It's really comes first from an understanding, preliminary understanding of what they're capable of, so that then in the design, we can start building things in that we know they can make. But then we really make sure that we push that as far as humanly possible, so that we can really have a dialogue with them, that we learn from them in the process, just as they learn, and learn to have greater confidence also through what we're asking them to do. Because one of the biggest things that we've had to combat working in kind of a post-colonial context is a lack of confidence. That is the biggest problem. That is why we go and copy elsewhere, because we have internalized the idea that somehow we don't have anything worthwhile, right, to offer, and that the answer lies elsewhere, within these people who apparently created everything under the sun. And that now we need to go and, and beg to be taught how to do, which is obviously preposterous, right? And so then, once that is done, and the building is finished, then the next phase is, well, how does the building evolve? And how does it, because that's why it starts before it's built. And that conversation with the users is so important, because it's directly linked to the way the building is designed in such a way that it serves these users and the life of that, of that building, in terms of the spaces it provides them to do all kinds of things. As you mentioned, it just ends up, taking a life of its own, things that you don't necessarily expect end up happening, but also in terms of not leaving a burden behind. I think one thing that is severely underestimated, but that we see all the time in so-called developing countries, is cities that seem to be in decay. And they're in decay because we're using materials that are not necessarily appropriate for the place, materials that are too expensive and difficult to replace, because either they have to be imported, or they're just too expensive. And so it's a one-time deal. You build it once and that's it. From then on, it's just falling apart.
Yeah.
So, one thing that is incredibly important for me is to design in such a way that either you need very little maintenance, or it's the kind of maintenance that is readily available, both in terms of skills, in terms of materials, in terms of technology, in terms of understanding also of how that technology and how the building process works. So in a way, a project just never, ever, ever ends. We have this, the Hikma complex that we built in Dandaji feels like it's still ongoing. We're going right now, this summer, we're going to add more water tanks under the ground because it turns out that we severely underestimated how much water there is during the rainy season. And so now we have to multiply by 4, actually, the amount of the water tank, because we didn't know, because no one is harvesting water. So we had a really hard time estimating how much water was going to be there. But at the same time, it's turning out that the building, the library that we made as part of the complex now has become kind of the central knowledge, point of the whole region, where people even from the capital city of the region come down to this village now to check out books, which we completely did not expect. Or we have the mosque that we were asked to design a mosque for up to 1,000 people, which was I thought too much for a village. And so we broke, that's why the volumes are also broken up, so that it's a bit more manageable. But it turns out that on day 1, when the mosque opened up, it was already too full, and people had to pray outside because it ended up becoming a regional mosque, not just a village mosque, where people basically trek every Friday an hour if they have to, just for the 12-minute prayer session for the Friday prayer. And so there's just all this life that these projects end up having, which, yes, are incredibly gratifying, but also, go to show that when you really design in tandem with other people, not as a monument to yourself, as an architect, as just kind of like this amazing master builder. At the end of the day, the project itself is what benefits. The project and the people who are using it are the 2 winners, of this thing. And I think that's what you want.
So maybe as I still push you on the making of the architect versus the making of the buildings, maybe I'll invite our hosts at MIT AV to bring all of our community members into the room and maybe ask you to think a little bit about this question of educating the architect as well, not just in school, but over their entire careers. Can we get everybody in? I don't see the, okay, we're great. Okay, apparently we're good. So Mariam, redesign architectural education for us in 30 seconds.
Fantastic. Well, I cannot pretend to do such a thing. I think all I can say, and I think that's what that was my message throughout the entire presentation. For me, I felt incredibly fortunate that I actually came into my architecture education with an alternative view of the world already. So everything I encountered in my architecture education was always taken not only with a grain of salt, but with great skepticism. And it also encouraged me to create a side education, I guess, for myself. In a way, I had to, because I knew already when I started studying architecture, I knew that I wanted to practice in places like Niger. And I could see that obviously, the references that I was looking at and the things I were being taught were completely overlooking every single reality that I knew was waiting for me, out there. So it ended up becoming kind of up to me to seek out the books, that would show me traditional architecture in that area, to think about globalization, to really understand, where even the precedents I was being shown in school, it was really important for me to understand where they were coming from. Where does the international stock come from? Where did these shape come from? They seem suspiciously similar to some of the shapes, from the Middle East and countries like mine, these pure geometric forms, yet, that is never acknowledged. It was just really about also demystifying kind of this glory of Western supremacy in a way. And, just realizing that none of that happened in a vacuum. It was not a coincidence that a lot of changes that happened in architecture and design, between the late 19th century, and the early to mid 20th century, yes, happened during, because of the Industrial Revolution, and all of that, but also happened at the same time as Asia and Africa and other areas of the world were being colonized by Europe. And then, their architecture, their design, their heritage being incorporated in different ways in these new styles, not just in architecture and design, but also obviously, I think what we're most familiar with is, for example, in the visual arts, Picasso and Cubism, things like that. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's about more painting a more intellectually or having more intellectually honest conversations, at the end of the day, and really being able to acknowledge the sources of the references that we have. Like I said, I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with the self-centered nature, of what we're teaching, but we need to acknowledge that it's self-centered. We need to acknowledge that it's just one way of doing it, and that there are all these other ways and all these other, this other wealth of knowledge out there, rather than, presenting ourselves as these providers of universal solutions that then we go out and really ram down the whole world's throat.
In that regard, I'm delighted that we're now joined by our own disciplinary future here and the students from the department. Let me turn it over to Mohammed Ismail to ask the next question.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nicholas. And thank you, Mariam, for a fascinating lecture. I mean, you've given us a lot to think about and respond to, as is very clear with the questions that are streaming in live. So we'll try our best to filter through both those and sort of some of the thoughts that we've had in response to what you've spoken about. If I may, I would love to start with a question about your background and how that ended up affecting your work. So I think, and feel free to correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, but your background reflects, I think, a more common occurrence of students that end up studying and training in areas away from home, especially international students. I'm one in that case, and after that experience, try to return to where they come from or where their family may have come from, and start practicing and really exploring some of what they learned, but also in a context that is very different from how they were trained. And I know that in places like, for instance, I come from Sudan, and if you come with a degree from the UK, which was our former colonizer, that is instantly a sort of gold medal and something that people will respect first and foremost. But we often don't hear about the other side where, are there, and this is the question specifically, were there challenges that you weren't expecting that came from your training abroad and return to Niger?
No, absolutely, and you're absolutely right, just kind of coming with that degree, even though it was from the US, which was not a former colonizer, but still, there was just kind of this stamp of approval that was immediate, like, oh yeah, you know what you're talking about. So, tell us what we need to do. And I think, the approach for me was from the beginning to pretend like I didn't know anything, So I just immediately just started asking questions, more so than telling people anything. Because as far as I was concerned, I had nothing to tell anyone. I have a training that allows me, to draw plans and sections and elevations, and like make 3D models, and things like that. I know how to design. I know how to, put together something pleasing looking, but doesn't mean that I know how to build in that place. No, so I think the very starting point has to be that we have to approach it from a point of humility. And without that humility, then it will always be this lopsided relationship where you come down with your amazing, foreign education and tell everybody what to do. And at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that you just end up applying whatever you were taught. So all these, modernist precedents and all of these, other things that you were taught, that's actually what you're going to reproduce. So you yourself will be part of the colonizing agents. And that was something that I was really aware of from the beginning. And I was very nervous about doing, and I'm still nervous about doing, and so it causes me to question what I do constantly. And always, approach it. And that's why, again, we do so many community and user, interaction and discussions, and questions, because I'm so petrified, of really reproducing, because it's part of our education of reproducing, these kind of automatic, precedents that that were being taught. Another challenge has been that often, depending on where you're practicing, we are overeducated. So then you need to find a way to actually communicate effectively in people who don't necessarily, are not necessarily going to understand everything on the blueprint that you're showing, or that are not necessarily, and you need to just have this level of flexibility, to figure out where the meeting point is. For you to have the most effective communication. I mean, I run construction sites where sometimes, like the detail that we're about to build is drawn on the sand, like right then and there. We draw it, they understand, we move on, end of story, So it doesn't have, and I think also because we've been trained to really be in love with our perfect architectural sets, the sets that we just, like bring, and that's kind of the construction set, and everything is ready. We feel competent when we have our set and all of our details, perfectly drawn. I had to learn not to draw so much. That was really, that was one of the things. And then had to learn to do a lot more design build. So we do a lot of prototyping. We do a lot of experimentation ourselves, actually in-house, that we end up then sharing with the contractors and masons that we work with, or we invite them to come over and teach us how to do certain things so that we understand them well enough to then draw them. So there's just all kinds of, back and forth that end up happening, but that flexibility is key to have.
What about Nada? Would you like to take the next question?
Yes, thank you, Nick. Thank you for your insightful talk, Mariam. Your work in Niger seems to draw from personal experience as well as community engagement, among other things. And I'm specifically thinking of mobile loitering. I thought the program was very powerful in how it directly addresses the context and culture. My question is, if an architect is invited to design in a context other than their own, or if you were to design in a different context, how can one approach the process thoughtfully?
I mean, actually, I think we have to maybe look at architecture in a way that the process is actually always the same. The result at the end of that process, needs to be different. So, for example, right now, we're working kind of all over, we're working in other African countries, we've just submitted a proposal for a project in New York, but then also we're working in the Middle East. And I'm really realizing that the process is the same. I'm going through the exact same process. So it might not take the same form. It might not be that, I go and actually find masons, to talk to, because it's not a context where there are masons, but it's the fundamental form of that process, meaning that you need to educate yourself on the local building technology, the local building expertise and skills, the local materials. No matter where you go, there are local materials. Even in the US, there are local materials. I think it's wood. You know, there are just all kinds of, no matter where you go, these things exist. You know, there's a local history, there's a local culture and way of using space and way of, you know, kind of like social interactions and all of those things. They're universal. The idea is to actually set up a process through which you uncover them everywhere you go. And then you put them together as a project. You know, you allow them to inform the project. So no matter what, you should be able to do the same thing. But then if you do it well, it shouldn't look the same as what you did in some other country. Even though, you know, like they can be formal, you know, inspirations. They could be, you know, colors that end up coming back just because, you know, you just kind of have these things that automatically or that appeal to you, you know, personally as a designer. But at the end of the day, you should be able to produce different kinds of forms and different kinds of spatial experiences that are uniquely tailored to that particular you know, set of people in that particular context.
Thank you.
Kylie, do you want to dive in here?
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. And thank you, Mariam. I wanted to bring it back maybe a bit to this question of architectural education and also your design process. For me personally, in my architectural education, a lot of the projects that we focused on, we kind of always looked at this final image of the building. And I just find it really interesting that your design process is really focused on the needs of the user and how someone might occupy or feel in the space after it's built. And so my question is, do you feel like this kind of focus on, let's say, iconography of a project is rooted in the Eurocentric version of architectural history that we're taught?
That's a great question. I think there are many things at play there. I think one of the first things it's rooted in is capitalism, actually, quite simply. It's the need for cities to have a certain image. It's the need for landmarks. It's the need for, you know, all kinds of different things. And really, architecture has always, in a way, been at the service, you know, of not only capitalism, but also it could be sometimes, you know, for at the service of a religion, for example. If you think about, you know, Roman architecture, you know, or something like that, or at the service, it all depends. What are the forces really driving that place? Architecture tends to be at the service of those forces a lot of times, because that's where the power lies. That being said, you know, I think we always have the option to put the user and the people in the forefront, even if that's not what the point is, you know, for the clients, because often the users and the clients are not the same thing, right? But it doesn't mean that you cannot have a process that starts from there and that really concerns itself with how the spaces are used. And for me, ultimately, that is really the true mandate of architecture. Because who are we doing that for? Like, we're making space. We're not making a sculpture. We're not, you know, like we're not visual artists. But I think we're turning ourselves into visual artists through our consumption, you know, of magazines, you know, the image consumptions, you know, through, and as Nicholas was saying, you know, like you make architecture, it gets photographed in perfect, pristine way. We do the same thing too, you know, like the photographs of our buildings, they're photographed right after the building is built and it looks beautiful, it looks perfect. But at the end of the day, I think as space makers, we have to care about more than that, right? Like we really have to care about what the spaces do to people who are in it. You know, you don't, I don't, you know, when I think about certain buildings, I won't name them, but like certain buildings that, for example, were landmarks, you know, for the cities they were built in, But then you would hear people say, oh, you know, if I spend 30 minutes in there, I feel nauseous. I mean, it's kind of a problem. So, you know, what is it? What is our mandate, you know, as architects? The other aspect of that is that I feel like if you're practicing in a context that is economically challenged or financially challenged, or capital, you know, doesn't have as much access to capital, it becomes even more important that the architecture is about space and what it can do for people and what it can allow people to do with each other, and how it can really help their interactions, how it can really help their day-to-day, how it can really shape their day-to-day, you know. So I think also, you know, different contexts call for different responses and different things, but at the end of the day, I mean, last I check, we're making space for human beings.
And I should also, I should also note that I think that architecture that is built for people can also be iconic. So, exactly. And I think that's what your projects do as well.
I try.
And I'm going to pass it to Mo for the next question.
Great. Thank you, Kylie. So I want to ask a question that might be almost unfair to ask, because it's similar to Nicholas's, you know, prompt to fix architectural education. You brought up the question of the sort of colonized narrative, especially when we're dealing with formerly colonized nations. And so there's a number of questions that are coming up from the audience, but one that I might ask that's a little bit more specific is in reference to something you've written, where you mention that the prevailing narrative of European and American architects, you know, oftentimes bringing modernism to colonized nations. And that's oftentimes where the history of those nations stops in architectural education. And it often ignores the other direction of transfer of knowledge, where there may have actually been a transfer from the colonized to the colonizer. And there's always, you know, very few examples of this. So I was curious if you had thoughts on why that narrative continues today, and again, unfairly, how do we correct it?
Oh yeah, no, I'm not completely sure how we correct it. I think there are just many, there are many things that have to be done to correct it. We can touch on that. But why it happened, I mean, we kind of know. It's kind of like this dirty world called imperialism. But not to be, you know, not to be revolutionary or anything. But at the end of the day, you know, if you look at it purely logically, you know, number one, you take over other countries for a reason. So there is exploitation there. There are resources that are extracted, and those resources bring in wealth into those nations, make them capital intensive, increases, you know, industry, production, standardization, all of those things. It's all kind of interlinked. So then the next chapter of that is that all of these things that you've produced, thanks to this capital that you acquired through all this exploitation, then needs to find markets. So right now, we're in a stage post-colonization where we are the market. We're the market of these capital produced, you know, objects, materials specifically, and ideology. You know, there's kind of this effort of, you know, you want to make the world in your image, number one. It kind of cements your supremacy. So that's one thing. But, you know, just very basically, your market. So cement is everywhere because we're a market. You have to make it, you know, even though that's not why it started, right? You know, like modernism had very noble intentions, you know, in the beginning. You know, it was supposed to be much more, the standardization was supposed to make, you know, housing affordable, was supposed to be able to make building easier, you know, and things like that. But then it was definitely used as a tool for architectural colonization of the rest of the world. And then there's this whole imagery that is being sold to the whole world, because it has this narrative in it that is very powerful, that is about progress. So, and everybody wants progress. And you're told that if you're not, you know, in progress and you have not really achieved progress somehow, you know, that automatically means that you're backwards. Nobody wants to feel that way. So you have on one hand a superiority complex, and on the other hand, a crippling inferiority complex. And all of that, it just kind of like, it's just this, I'm trying to find a polite word to say that. But anyway, let's move on. I can only think of curse words. But anyway, it's just kind of the perfect storm, right? And then it just kind of spreads like wildfire, to the point where at this point, we don't know how else to be contemporary. We don't know how else to be modern, because we've coined this term, modernism, you know, and modernity has now an aesthetic. Being modern means looking like this particular thing. And if you're not modern, you're less than. So psychologically, how do you combat that, you know, as a people, as nations, you know, and all of that? It's brilliant, frankly. And so then, yeah, and then, you know, you do all of that and then you have a market. In a way, it's the same formula as Hollywood. You know, you make these amazing images, you have these buildings, you have this way of life, and you have, you know, these this perfection that you sell and that you show, and this desirability, you know, and people want what they know and what they've seen. An image is powerful. So then to the second part of your question, how do we, all of that has to be addressed at the end of the day, you know. One of the one of the aspects is that it needs to also come from us. It's not necessarily from the Western world to protect us from it. Some of the work also has to come from us, and that has to come with a certain level of emancipation from this psychological subservience, which is going to take time. And it has to do on the other side with an acknowledgement of not only that exploitation, of that colonization and that continued colonization, that colonization of knowledge, of this kind of appropriation of really everything under the sun. Because if you think about even museums, right? Museums really became what we know of today as these large, you know, receptacles of objects and artifacts because of colonization, because of looted artifacts all over the world that were brought back and then needed to be put somewhere in order to show to the local populations. That's what created museums, right? So then now, even the experts on these other parts of the world are Western. The objects and the things that allow understanding are in the West. Everything has been just kind of co-opted and appropriated. So maybe one of the things that needs to happen is that there needs to be an undoing of a lot of those ills and a lot of those. I'm really trying to be polite. Yeah, there just needs to be an acknowledgement of all of that. But then also, you know, to what Nicholas was saying in the beginning, you know, it's just words, right? At the end of the day, there needs to be a plan to start acknowledging that these things happen, number one, how they happened, what does it look like? And actually all of the things that we enjoy here in terms of knowledge, in terms of styles, in terms of aesthetic, you know, all of that, a lot of it came from elsewhere, was co-opted from elsewhere. Even that goes a long way into then on the other side, providing greater confidence to everybody else to say, oh, you know what, I can actually rely on what makes me me, my identity, my culture, and all of those things, and create a new way forward for myself. Because I think the dangerous thing is to also put it in the hands of the same, you know, quote unquote colonizers and say that now you have to fix it. Well, they have to fix it, they're gonna fix it in their image. So we didn't make it, but we have to fix it for ourselves. It just goes on and on. It's just kind of like this circular, everything is kind of intertwined. So there's no straightforward answer to it. It will have to be a process. It's a long process in the same way that it was a long process to get here. It will be equally long to find our way back. Probably.
Yeah, that's.
I think, oh, go ahead, Mel.
No, I was just going to say that a lot of what you said resonates, and I appreciate you saying, especially the differential in confidence being such a big difference, and yeah, I'm excited to see some of the institutions that are popping up in Africa and trying to reclaim some of those narratives, but there's still so much to do. So I appreciate you saying that. Sorry, Nicholas, I cut you off.
Oh, no, I was actually going to say that I think Nada has a very related question that I'd love to hear as well.
Thank you, Nicholas. So a lot of large-scale architectural projects in countries in the global south are entrusted by locals and even governments to Western architects because, like you said, the solutions are thought to be found there, even though environmental and contextual issues could be essentially disparate. And I see that happen a lot in Arab countries like Saudi or the Emirates. So is that a recurring theme in Niger? And how can we as architects be agents in changing that pattern?
I mean, it's a global theme, everywhere. And I think in the same way that, so there are 2 reasons or 3 reasons why a foreign firm would be called into, any non-Western country. Number 1, there's the aspiration for what exists in that Western world, being brought back here or there. Number 2, there's a perceived or real, it depends on what we're talking about, difference in expertise, where you feel that the local architects maybe might not have the expertise to handle the large-scale project that you have in mind. But that, again, goes back to number 1, because at the end of the day, if you were not aspiring to this Western model of a project, maybe you wouldn't have this problem to begin with. So I think part of the solution also lies with us as architects, in that it is also our responsibilities to put out there examples that can be aspirational. And I always say architecture is way too expensive to fault a client for wanting, to get their money's worth. It's highly unreasonable. We look down on developers. We always, speak badly of, all the people who are kind of accounting their money in sense, but we're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars. It's completely unreasonable for us to expect that, or to expect that whoever is commissioning the project is just going to magically just want to do, quote unquote, the right thing of doing an architecture that is more local or that is more, appropriate to the context and all of those things, when they don't know where that's supposed to look like. Because at the end of the day, all of the images are only these Western images that we see. So then we, as non-Western architects, then need to start circulating somehow images of other types of architecture that could be equally aspirational, where people can actually really see themselves in and feel like that's something that they would dream of having. And for us as a firm, that's one of the reasons, for example, that I find really important that our work is published, like all over the world. It's actually only for that reason. It's for that aspirational aspect. It's now for our own publicity. It's actually so that there are other examples out there that then people locally can say, oh, I saw that you did such and such project. It looked, it was very monumental. I really felt like it has a lot to do with who I am as a person, or, or who we are as a country, or who we are as a city. And I want that, or I want something more like that. The reality is we cannot expect, like our job, we are the creatives. It is our job to imagine what's possible. We cannot ask that of your regular average person who doesn't have our training to imagine something that they've never seen before. right? Because the only thing that they've seen are maybe examples from 100, 200, 300 years ago. So when you say that it needs to be contextual, the immediate panic is, wait, do you mean that I need to go back to like looking the way we did 100 and 200 years ago? Because I was told that that was backwards, and that I would not have any of that. So at the end of the day, I think it might be up to us.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Kylie?
Sure, thanks, Nicholas. This follows on from kind of exactly what you were just talking about, having, you know, good examples of projects out in the world in order to also reframe the way that we understand history. And I was wondering if there are any projects that you're excited about, either built projects or, you know, documentation projects as well, that are changing the way how we narrate architectural history.
You know, I'm so ashamed to say that I'm so kind of, you know, kind of like zoomed into the work that we do and how unbelievably taxing it is that I rarely look up to see what's going on. In the beginning, I did that deliberately. I remember when I started practicing, because I was really afraid of being influenced by what was happening. Because I was definitely aware that aside from a couple of, you know, architects that I really admired, a lot of the architecture that I was seeing, you know, in publications, you know, things that I really didn't have anything to do with, you know, where I was, you know, and the kinds of problems that I was seeing, or the kinds of challenges that I was interested in tackling, whether it's sustainability, whether it's, you know, cultural appropriateness and issues of identity and issues of, you know, social and spatial justice and all of those things. So I was really worried about, because an image is so powerful, right? So I was really worried about having that in my head. So I actually started practicing by just kind of putting my head in the sand and just never, you know, emerging. And unfortunately, I think it's becoming a habit now, which I'm kind of embarrassed by, because I never really know what's going on.
Well, you're influencing lots of people even as you resist being influenced. So I think that's not a bad place to be.
Well, I just wanted to add that, you know, one thing though is that I feel that the practice is really going in a better direction, you know, because of challenges now, you know, with COVID, but also in terms of, because of the challenges created by climate change. I think we're definitely realizing that we no longer have a choice for many things. And so there's definitely, you know, this effort to really start going in directions that is not solely based on kind of like the iconography, you know, the architect, the building as an icon, but really the building as something that does something more. And obviously I'm incredibly excited because I'm biased to that, you know, by a lot of what's happening on the African continent right now from an architectural point of view, you know, whether it's, you know, by architects like Francis Carré or David Adjaye doing these amazing new buildings and really kind of putting, and I think that's really what will also help things, you know, down the line, putting on the page examples that are no longer these classic examples that we always see from these couple of parts of the world, but really helping to put on the map solutions for, you know, different African countries, different contexts, you know, within the African continent, and really showing new examples and new kind of forms and spaces to aspire to. And I think we all, you know, should celebrate that.
Well, that is a great moment to end, which unfortunately we have to do, at least for this evening. Although I will say, Mariam, one of the predictable results in time and space of such an amazing evening with you is that we are going to have you back, whether you like it or not. So
I would love that.
But thank you so much, Mariam, for the time and care you've taken with this presentation and conversation. And thank you so much to our student participants for giving the same and making us all a team up here. So I would really also like to thank the team behind the team that produces these events, Amanda Moore, all of our communications assistants, and Tom and our other friends at MIT AV. So with that, we hope you will join some of all of them and me and some of us next Thursday, April 15th, for Happening Now, another research studio conversation with Katie Newell, Virginia Sanfrantello, Brandon Clifford, and Zane Carson. You can see our full list of upcoming events, of course, at architecture.mit.edu. And we hope to see you with us again, which is, of course, a figure of speech right now, that we hope over time very soon to actually see you with us again as well. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor. Thank you.